Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Right, well, we've seen the Donald Trump communication style this evening. Let's talk about Theresa May, because there's something rather intriguing about how quiet she is. She's the opposite of Donald Trump and some of her predecessors, in fact, who perhaps felt that the head of government job is one that requires you to keep yabbering on about anything and everything, from policy and politics to sport and soap operas. It's not post-truth for Theresa May, it's post-nothing, stay quiet, just go dark. We'll reflect on the merits of that approach, but first here's Chris Cook on the contrast with the practices of yore.
Since July and the change of Prime Minister, the government has been a bit cool with the press. This week, though, as one Times reporter put it, they went dark. With Parliament in recess, the government went quiet. It really is quite unusual for a whole government to be pursuing a submarine media strategy. But that's what's going on. And a lot of it's down to Theresa May's own personal attitude to the media. She doesn't regard it as her job to give people like me things to talk about or write about. Now, when I put it in those terms, perhaps you have some sympathy with her. But here's the big question. As a political strategy, does it really work to avoid the light? Here's the rationale for feeding the beast from a past master.
Look, it's a 24-hour-a-day news media. If a story comes out that says something and you haven't got the capacity to get on top of it and say, no, hang on, sorry, the facts are X and Y. And as you've probably discovered, I mean, it's not as if, these stories don't take a life of their own and then start running away into the far distance, and then the public thinks, oh my goodness, what on earth are they doing that for when you're not doing it at all?
The current Prime Minister clearly doesn't feel any great pressure, with her current poll lead, to engage very much. She went on the Copeland by-election trail yesterday in Cumbria, where she spent under 3 minutes taking 2 questions from one reporter.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you.
Back. Thank you very much.
It's a fair bet, then, that the current PM won't emulate Ted Heath, shown here showing off his talent as a sailor for the cameras. And here, showing off his musicianship. Showing hinterland would mean having cameras in, and that means questions. The May approach, though, can save you from trivia. Tony Blair, shown here in opposition, later opined on the jailing of Deirdre Rashid, a character from Coronation Street. Even David Cameron's tweeting about British sporting success somehow seems an age away. Maybe this will work. A low profile might preserve the sheen that attaches to new prime ministers. But more pressure from other parties or events might change all of this. Right now, the polls suggest her low-profile approach is working.
Chris Cook. Well, I'm joined by the broadcaster and columnist Steve Richards, by Aisha Hazarika, who was a special advisor to both Ed Miliband and Harriet Harman, and by Matt Chorley, who was that Times journalist who used this phrase, going dark. Matt, is it a pain for you that you don't get stories from her?
Well, that is, I mean, going dark is actually a phrase used in Number 10. They say we are going dark this week, and they took a conscious decision that this week it was recess, all the MPs were on holiday, and journalists left in Westminster were left to their own devices. I think it does seem to be working. I mean, they say every time a journalist says, go on, give us a story, otherwise it's going to be really bad for you, this lack of media coverage. They say, well, do you want to have a look at our latest poll ratings? So they think it's working for now.
How different is it to your days, Aisha?
It's very different, and it was actually interesting seeing Tony Blair popping up, because I think New Labour in the run-up to 97 and when we first got into power, we sort of set the rule book in terms of media communications, because we professionalised media communications, and we set up this grid, and everyone was obsessed about feeding the grid.
You need to explain this grid, because we hear about what is this grid?
So the grid is the sort of 7 days mapped out, and you have to have events in the grid, and we would have grid meetings, a grid manager. I mean, a lot of job creation is generated by the grid. But I think, to quote Tony Blair, there's a third way in all of this, right? Because you don't want to become so obsessed with just the grid wagging the sort of tail. And you need some thinking time to actually populate the grid.
Right. But before I come to Steve, Matt, is there no grid at the moment?
There is a grid. And the rule is don't put anything on it. That's the difference. Is that we are not committing news. And you speak to special advisors and to ministers and other government departments, and they say we'd love to do stuff. We've got stuff backing up, and we're trying to get stuff on the grid.
So what is it? It's number 10 saying we don't want stuff on the grid.
But you know, they take the view. Why rock the boat? The risk when you put a minister on the TV is that they say something which generates news.
Yeah, or just say something.
Just say something at all, yeah.
OK, Steve, you've been around a while. You've looked at prime ministers. You've written about prime ministers. Is it the right thing for her to do?
You make me sound about 150.
No, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to.
But I think it depends partly on context and partly on the personality of the individual. With New Labour, they had suffered such a terrible press in the 80s and early 1990s. Certainly the New Labour generation were totally obsessed, partly justifiably, but partly to the point where it becomes stifling. As you quote, you know, what are we going to say about Coronation Street? We've got to do this. You know, they were in a complete sort of... I was once having a cup of tea with Tony Blair early on in his first term. He was about 40 points ahead in the polls. And William Hague was leader of the opposition, already doomed. And during the cup of tea, someone rushed in from his press team saying, Hague's about to say something on the privatisation of rural post offices. What are we going to do? What's our message? I mean, anyone would think they're about to collapse as a government. And now that becomes stifling. Her approach is really interesting, I think. She, as a personality, is much shyer than Tony Blair, David Cameron. I think she's a shy person. It's quite interesting in such a public position. I think her media performances are authentically awkward because she is shy. So she doesn't enjoy them. Cameron and Blair, on the whole, enjoyed them. And so it's partly her own reticence. Now, she can get away with it with opinion poll leads and an opposition in disarray, but there will be times when it becomes an issue for her. I've got no doubt.
The problem is the vacuum, because you've got to write something. You do the red box column, there's an email you send out every morning. You've got to fill it with something. And if she's not giving you something, you can be mischievous.
Yes, I mean, we've seen this week business rates. Business rate rises have been planned for some time. But this week, it's become front page, and it's on the front pages again tomorrow. This big rise in business rates is coming, and it's affecting pubs that people love and hospitals that people love. And that feels like this week, because it's been recessed, the government hasn't been doing anything, business rates has taken on a life of its own. And will probably mean that the Chancellor, when the budget comes in a couple of weeks' time, will have to do something about it.
Because it's had a prominence because they haven't been distracting us with lots of other things.
But, I mean, I think at the moment, because the opposition is so weak, also because there is the distraction of Brexit and also when Trump wakes up in the morning and hits the old tweet deck. So I think the danger for the government and Number 10, the press operation is, I think they can be quite complacent about it now, but they shouldn't forget that there's lots of domestic crises bubbling up. The NHS, business rates, there's cuts to the school budgets. There are things that the public are getting exercised about, and just having a press strategy which stonewalls everything is not going to be that sustainable for a long time.
See, I think, in a way, at this point, it's quite sensible. For example, on Brexit, everyone will say, what's her plan? She hasn't got one. The Economist did a front page about, you know, there is no plan. It's all chaos. And then she did a speech. Yeah. Now, I disagree with some of the content of the speech, but in form, it was almost a work of art, which they had worked and sweated over for a long period, but quite an effective way of doing things. Wait and then deliver. You can do it when you're in control of party and government, as she is at the moment. Yeah. It becomes harder when you lose control, which will happen to her at some point. The other thing I would say, I've just been doing some talks with the BBC about 6 prime ministers. What's interesting about what I've learned as I kind of ad-libbed my way through these talks was that the ones who lasted longest were, one way or another, teachers. They regarded part of their role constantly to communicate. Thatcher was an instinctive teacher, always communicating simple, accessible messages as a matter of human course, almost. And Blair did the same. He wants to... So in the end, I think you do have to constantly explain and explain and explain.
But maybe the story of 2016-17 is that the kind of the New Labour spin model adopted by Cameron, it was completely bust, and on the two sides of the Atlantic, you've got two completely contrasting new models. Trump is obviously completely broken all the rules of the old spin model, and Theresa May is breaking them. And I mean, if you sort of sat back and you asked yourself, which of the two new models do you prefer? Which would you say, Matt?
Well, I think you're right, and I think the danger is that because journalists like to be given stories and some politicians like to be in newspapers, that we think lots of stories in newspapers about politicians is what the public want. And actually, I think the reaction to the sort of spin culture, which people got more and more fed up with, is that they quite like not seeing the Prime Minister on the telly every night telling us what they think about literally every passing thing
I think
going.
that's right. I think there's a balance to be struck. I think you slip into a danger as a politician if you think success is measured by how many splashes you get, and you know, having worked for lots of politicians, the biggest thing that they sometimes rush in is, why am I not in the newspapers? I'm having an existential crisis. But actually, you need the balance of, as Steve was saying, which is a good example of the Brexit speech that she did, doing less, but doing it better. So having the time to properly think through your message, your policy, your strategy, and then the kind of communications should sort of be the icing on the cake. When everything is driven, when a grid gets out of control and you're just trying to keep up with the grid, that's very scary.
You can cheapen
Imagine being Trump's spin doctor tonight if the focus was on message discipline. And,
I think that ship has sailed.
I think they've moved on from that one.
We need to leave it there.